Contrast might be defined as setting two things in opposition. It could be taking two opposites and juxtaposing them against each other. Most of you already know what contrast is and what contrast looks like, but I think what I want you to do as far as addressing contrast in a design context is to think about different ways that you can juxtapose items visually. As soon as you put black text on a white page, you're using contrast. Okay, you're using contrast of value. But there's all sorts of different types of contrast you can utilize, and I want to show you examples of these. Primarily, you're using contrast to draw attention to a particular part of your design. Contrast is extremely effective in taking the viewer and focusing their attention where you want it. It's extremely useful in terms of visual design because you're basically, with it, you're able to control the viewer's perception of what it is you're presenting, and you're able to sort of guide them through your overall visual design. You can also use contrast to distinguish and separate clutter elements. Say, for example, if you have a lot of information to present on a single sheet of paper, you can use contrast creatively to distinguish and separate different parts of your poster, of your magazine cover, whatever it is you're designing, so that people can digest the information more easily. Some types of contrast we'll look at: size, color, shape. You know, is it straight versus crooked? Is it perpendicular, angular, thick or thin? As far as texture, is it rough? Is it smooth? Is it shiny? Is it dull? Font, serif fonts versus sans serif fonts, display fonts versus easily legible fonts. We've looked at these in the tutorial on type, or at least you have if you've already looked at that lecture. But anyway, let's go ahead straight to the examples and let's take a look. Some examples of contrast. Here's an example of contrast that I thought was fairly amusing. Contrast of expectation. In other words, we have this sort of repetition of this pattern of the husky dogs, which visually match up very well. They're the same breed, they have the same markings, and that repetition that's established visually is also heightened by the simplicity of the background. The Arctic background with the consistent texture in the clouds from edge to edge, the consistent landscape of the height of the mountains, the color and the shading of the mountains from edge to edge, and then the icy plain. Everything is very consistent and very simplistic, with the exception of the wiener dog suspended there in midair. And again, it's just, this can symbolize any number of things, but just in terms of flat-out contrast, it's drawing our attention in a very direct fashion. Contrast of size, contrast of shape, contrast of color, they're all at work here. Here we have contrast of texture. Thought a clever use in terms of a leaflet that this graphic designer has used to publicize their business. And again, it just draws attention due to the contrast of the texture here, the glossy Band-Aid sticking out over the sort of rough, coarse paper texture that they've used recycled paper here in this example. So the sort of sheen, plastic sheen versus the rough matted surface of the recycled paper. Now in this example of this brochure, this designer has used contrast very effectively in terms of taking advantage of value adjustments, going from black to white on each page, and using high contrast photographs, everything in black and white. And just, I think it's just a good example of how dramatic you can make layout and photographs by reducing them to black and white and grayscale information. Notice also the contrast in layout techniques as they go from a sort of three-column photo sequence over here to a very large blank space where text is the only element. In this poster, I thought there was a very effective use of negative and positive space. This kind of brings us into that realm of optical illusions. In this case, demonstrating the visual principle that the human brain can really only perceive one of these shapes at a time. We can see the dagger and the heart, or we can perceive the lovers embracing. But when our mind switches back and forth between these two different elements, the positive and the negative, animation, and kind of draws us in visually. But also, it's just a clever technique to sort of breathe new life into an old familiar subject, in this case, the classic Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. Again, very similar example to the Wiener dog we saw before, in this case, showcasing the SUV as a very safe vehicle, something that could be a lifesaver. And again, that repetition of patterns at work here, very consistent backgrounds, consistent color schemes, consistent shapes overall as we go from left to right in the panorama, with the exception of the dark vehicle here, of course, using contrast of shape, contrast of value. Not so much contrast of size, but contrast of position also. You notice that the vehicle, the way it's positioned, is just slightly offset compared to the repetitive pattern of the lifeboats. This, I thought, was an effective use of color contrast, utilizing the white space to draw our attention to the missing piece of the puzzle. You'll notice that there's an effective use of contrast to draw us to the most important part of each one of these posters. And the idea, of course, being that if we're trying to, if we have that missing piece to the puzzle, then we can solve the crime, and then we'll basically be able to call this number and save the day. But each one of these photographs, again, is very well selected in terms of containing one missing component that if we were to have that missing element, that missing puzzle piece, we would have the critical information necessary towards solving the crime. I like also the connection between the use of white on the logo and the phone number, and the use of white here as the most critical element of the page. Now here's an example of contrast of texture. Again, a very slick, glossy coat on a very rough corrugated cardboard. Contrast of color, taking a warm, bright orange here in the middle, and a slant of red here, just a slice of red here on the side, contrasted with the grayscale information in the texture. Really draws our attention where we're supposed to look. Now, we've seen a lot of examples of high contrast and utilizing strong juxtaposition in shape, color, size to direct our attention. I think this is a good example of low contrast in terms of this background, and just sort of utilizing a low contrast situation, so not so much to draw our attention, but usually with low contrast you're trying to smooth things out a little bit, make them a little bit more subliminal, sort of push them into the background arena. And I think that the tree here does a good job of that. Very sort of diffused, blurred out photograph of the tree with a sort of low contrast brown against the beige sky. Now in this case, you need to know a little bit about golf to understand this, but what we're doing here is we're looking at the putting green, a familiar icon of golf. And I don't know if you can see it well on your computer or not, but this flag here, which in golf is used to mark the hole which the golfer is trying to put the ball into. this is a familiar icon with any golfer, but normally, of course, the flag is at the top of the stick. And this, I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but the top of the flag post is up here, and so the idea being that the flag is raised to half-mast, and what this is a photograph specifically for a tribute to Payne Stewart, who was a golfer whose life was ended tragically, and the idea is that they're combining the concept of a flag at half-mast and contrasting that concept against our expectations of seeing the flag at full in the normal position. It's just sort of a jarring image that, if you're a golfer, would really stand out. In this case, we're using size and shape to pull our attention to each one of these different choices here. This is a interactive menu, in which case it's very critical to design buttons that people can recognize and understand easily and separate from the background very easily. So in this case, going with high contrast white on black and juxtaposition of size here with the very large scale logo in the middle that we're going to look at first, with very high contrast elements, very bright whites, very strong blacks, versus a little bit more of a muted beige tone or off-white for the button choices. Of course, also much smaller size. Again, another contrast of texture here. This one using the bright gold leaf and contrasting that against the more muted, dull, matte coating here of the paper. Another contrast of texture, in this case color as well, using this sort of bright red ribbon to draw attention to the front of the bottle, and contrasting the rough, organic, and earth tones that we see here for the box. This sort of higher contrast label that's a little bit more refined as opposed to the rough texture of the box. In this case, again, using contrast of size, which is very effective, just to separate each individual choice here as far as the interactive website is concerned, the interface, large to small. Here's a nice example of contrast of type, using different font choices in different sizes and colors to emphasize the word resurrection. Also does a good job, I think, of tying together the author's name with the title of the book in terms of using the same font with the name of the author and the beginning of the name of the title. One thing you'll notice is that clearly the designer is emphasizing more than anything else the word resurrection and utilizing contrast to really pull our attention towards that particular word. So we can only assume that the interior of the book, the subject matter of the book, will make light of this subject. Here's one I think is very effective. Again, sort of playing with contrast of texture, but doing it in a very creative fashion to illustrate that people prefer the taste of Pepsi over Coke. Another low contrast example. Most, again, were high contrast examples, so I thought I'd throw a few low contrast because there are occasions where low contrast comes into play. I think this is a better example than the previous one, and that it really does a great job, I think, of showing how subtle you can make a background texture by reducing the contrast of a photograph. Notice how the photograph doesn't compete as it would if it was at a normal contrast setting, where the grayscale information would be much darker, and the light information here outside of the dancer's body, the background would probably be a lot lighter. We're able to draw more attention to the title of the book, or in this case, the title of the ballet. We're basically able to pull the attention where we want it rather than to the dancer. This makes the dancer more of a subliminal element, an important design element, but not something that is going to dominate the viewer's attention. In this case, we have a musician and a CD cover. I think that the reason I put this in here was to show a couple of things. First off, notice is the contrast again of text, size, font, just to sort of separate the two sides of this design structure, left to right, but mainly also because of the contrast in photograph choices. Notice the musician here in the middle, who is the same musician, Joe Henderson, in this photograph. The black and white photograph, he's not playing, he's very small in size, angular frame, and he's staring straight at camera, flush, parallel with the camera. Now, on the other side, the right side, he's in full color, he's extremely large, he's playing his instrument, so basically kind of gives you the idea that when he is playing his music, he really comes to life. And notice the diagonal nature of the lines of the saxophone and the position of his body, again, just sort of breathing life into this photograph and making him seem much more alive when he's playing his instrument as opposed to when he's just posing for the portrait. Thought that was a nice contrast there of color, of line, of direction, of a lot of different things, of size, that really works well. This one's pretty basic. Again, just contrast in terms of black and white and color side by side, just to sort of break up the monotony of a multi-page layout where you've got a lot of photographs. Now in this case, this is a poster for a debate. Multiple viewpoints is really the subject here. And so I thought it was a very effective use of design to capture the essence of a debate, which is basically to showcase two opposing viewpoints in one forum. So you notice the design, the shapes of the design are consistent and very well balanced throughout the entire page, giving a sense of solidarity to the event. But contrast steps in by dividing the image in the middle and allowing the designer to compose the shapes in two entirely different ways, white on black and black on white. So you have similarity and you have differences all tied together with a very simple design structure, and I think that it's just very, very clever in its layout. Now here we're using color and again, just sort of dividing the page straight down the middle, this time for emphasizing the nature of choice, emphasizing the nature of you have two different choices, A or B, and then on page 2 you find that yes, it's both. You can choose both and have and still come out on top. Basically, this is an advertisement for a university, saying can a university be two things at once? And they're arguing that yes, it can. And the design is there to prove it by showcasing the fact that, again, it's very similar to the last poster in the sense that you've got two different colors schemes, but again, they seem the same because they're helping to compose a consistent shape, group of shapes that makes up the overall design structure, but they're just dividing the space in half and doing it with light on dark and then dark on light on the other side. works very effectively. Again, it just emphasizes the nature, the difference of the two choices, but at the same time, they're brought together through the unity of the design structure and the shape. That's basically it. Hopefully this has been useful in helping you understand a little bit more about contrast and how powerful contrast can be in your visual communication process.